se asuste con la migra.
Transmite en su canal de frecuencia modulada estereofónica multiplex La Voz Radio, desde New Haven, Connecticut, al mundo.
Eso mero.
Aló. Ya. Bueno, compañeros, estamos aquí en la WNHH 103.5 FM, aquí en La Voz Hispana Radio, transmitiendo desde el centro de la ciudad de New Haven y también a través de nuestras plataformas de Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Y recuerden que ayer hicimos ayer un anuncio, pues básicamente de que hay una acción diferida para trabajadores que están siendo explotados o una especie de protección por parte migratoria, por parte del Departamento de Seguridad Nacional para trabajadores que han sido explotados y que están denunciando a sus patrones. Entonces, pues la idea es de que queremos hacer un anuncio y pues ahorita mismo hay una conferencia a nivel nacional, entonces los voy a dejar con la conferencia a nivel nacional porque finalmente hoy se hizo el anuncio por parte del secretario Mayorkas, que es el secretario de Seguridad Nacional de origen cubano, y pues él ahora van a escuchar básicamente lo que va a decir la gente frente a este anuncio. Entonces los dejo en la conferencia de prensa y más tarde, pues si termina antes de las 4 de la tarde, pues haremos unos comentarios adicionales, si no ya la semana entrante seguiremos hablando sobre este tema y las implicaciones para la comunidad inmigrante. Gracias.
To protect workers that denounce workplace abuse, to protect workers that work throughout the pandemic, to protect workers that, for example, have family members or loved ones that died during the pandemic. They have the authorities. The Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Labor have the authority to do this since day one of the Biden administration. And so for the first 2 years of the Biden administration, these organizations have repeatedly engaged with the DOL Secretary Walsh, DHS Secretary Mayorkas, to remind progress. Them. Thank you. And there's the reminder. So now we're being recorded, everybody, just a heads up. So from day one, these worker centers across the country have been engaging with the Departments of Labor and Homeland Security to use the power they have to protect these workers. On October 21st, in October of 2021, DHS actually released an initial kind of request for its agencies to develop these kinds of policies. In response, a lot of these worker centers launched a Blue Ribbon Commission on immigrant work to make sure that there was a space for workers across industries to make visible the kinds of abuses that exist across the United States and to engage in what kind of protections would be needed to prevent retaliation, to prevent the repeated violation of workers' rights. The Blue Ribbon Commission held a series of open hearings, assemblies, marches, actions across the country from Mississippi, in Texas, in California, New York, New Jersey, all the way to Washington, D.C., Georgia, and actually did a presentation for DHS throughout the last year. And, you know, it finally, and engaging with both DOL and DHS. And finally, in July of this year, last year, 2022, the Department of Labor took the first steps to announce their own department guidelines in the form of a frequently asked questions document, explaining what the process would be to engage with the Department of Labor. In addition, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, also was very clear about its process and initiated some cases. But until today, the Department of Homeland Security had not followed up on its initial commitment to pronounce publicly what this process is for DHS. And so that's where we are today. Finally, after 2 years, Secretary Mayorkas has made clear what that guideline is to make sure that the Department of Homeland Security is not being utilized by employers to target workers, to threaten workers, to abuse workers, to keep workers from advancing their workplace abuses. And today, this morning at a meeting, which National Day Labor, the Endelon co-executive director, Nadia Marin Molina, was in the meeting this morning with Secretary Mayorkas, and she on behalf of day laborers and immigrant undocumented workers across the country, asked Secretary Mayorkas if he would help promote the policy, right? Because a policy that nobody knows about isn't an effective policy. And if the President Biden himself would be announcing the policy, promoting the policy, defending the policy. And so that's an outstanding question that we can get more into. But first, we want to hear directly from the voices that are helping push this policy forward from the Blue Ribbon Commission. And we'll start with the director of the Arriba Las Vegas Worker Center, who are moving one of the emblematic pilot cases in the country, and some of the workers who have been the leaders of this national effort. And with that, I introduce Bliss Requa-Trout from the Arriba Las Vegas. Adelante.
Good afternoon. Audio okay? Great. Good afternoon. My name is Bliss Requa-Trout, Executive Director with Arriba Las Vegas Worker Center. Immigrant workers have been at the front lines of a crisis of labor abuses for decades. For too long, labor enforcement has been hindered by civil immigration enforcement. For too long, immigrant workers have been silenced in the face of abuses, as punitive ICE raids and the threat of immigration enforcement has hindered the application of labor law. From Las Vegas, we join workers across the country, in Chicago, in Georgia, in Mississippi, in Texas, to celebrate a step forward ensuring that immigrant workers' rights can be protected and enforced. With this important step towards ensuring that DHS will not undermine labor enforcement and worker organizing. Excuse me. In June 2021 from Las Vegas, Nevada, Rosario Ortiz was the first undocumented worker to stand up publicly and call for these necessary protections under the Biden administration. Shortly after, he was joined by Jonas Reyes and Isaac Umania from Las Vegas, Nevada. They are not alone. We uplift their leadership that has been pivotal to an open pathway for workers to successfully bring complaints and organize to form unions. Today is a victory for immigrant workers across the country who have faced workplace abuses. Moreover, it is a victory that belongs to those who stood up and spoke up without protection, at great personal risk, and who fought to make this policy a reality. We are hopeful that the policy DHS Secretary Mayorkas has announced is a step in the right direction and moves towards a path with continued commitment to protect immigrant worker whistleblowers and workers who organize their coworkers for fair conditions. Under this new policy, DHS will consider applications for employment authorization and deferred action, protect workers from deportation when they have experienced or witnessed labor law violations or are part of a labor agency investigation. We know and acknowledge that these protections do not mean that workers will be free from retaliation when they report abuse or organize on their job site, as abusive employers will continue to retaliate illegally against workers until labor enforcement agencies take action to ensure compliance. But these protections, when exercised, mean that workers won't be deported for exercising their protected rights to a minimum wage, safe working conditions, freedom from discrimination, and the right to organize. We are cautiously optimistic these policies will move toward the working conditions we all deserve. We call on President Biden to stand on the side of workers, to uplift these important labor enforcements, to defend against potential attacks, and to expand protections to ensure that our deported workers are returned to claim their wages, restore their rights, and ensure that labor enforcement in this country will continue to be effective moving forward. Together, we can raise the floor for all workers and turn the tide against persistent and pervasive workplace abuses. And now I'd like to introduce Rosario Ortiz, one of the first workers to receive protections under this administration. Can we do an interpretation check, please?
Yes, ready. And I'll be interpreting for Mr. Ortiz.
Hola, buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Rosario Ortiz.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Rosario Ortiz.
Desde Las Vegas, a Washington, D.C., a Mississippi, a Nueva York, a Georgia, Alabama. Hemos estado luchando sin descansar para llegar a este momento.
From Las Vegas to Washington, D.C., from Mississippi to New York, from Georgia to Alabama, we've been fighting without rest to arrive together to this point.
Mis compañeros y yo hemos luchado nuestro caso por más de 3 años, enfrentando amenazas e intimidaciones, además del robo de salario y riesgos de salud y seguridad como trabajadores de la compañía Unforgettable Coding Inc.
So my colleagues and I have now been struggling for over 3 years, facing retaliation and threats, wage theft, health and safety violations, and all sorts of workplace abuses from our employer, the company Unforgettable Coding.
Nos reunimos personalmente con el secretario del Trabajo, Mary Wash, con el secretario Mayorkas, con el llamado para pedir protecciones hacia los trabajadores que sufrimos abuso laboral.
And we actually met personally with Secretary of Labor Walsh, with Secretary of DHS Mayorkas, calling specifically for these protections to advance our workplace rights.
Hoy me siento orgulloso de nuestros compañeros y hermanos y hermanas en todo el país con quienes hemos luchado para abrir este camino.
And I feel proud today for all of us across the country who we have struggled with together, that we have walked this path together.
Para que otros compañeros que están en circunstancias parecidas de abusos laborales puedan buscar las protecciones que nosotros hemos ganado como una acción diferida.
So that others that are in similar situations can seek and obtain the kinds of protections that we have been able to win, this deferred action.
Para nosotros, aquí en Las Vegas, todo empezó buscando ayuda en el centro, arriba Las Vegas, por el robo de salario sufrido en la compañía Unforgettable Coding.
And for us here in Las Vegas, it all started when we walked into the Worker Center here at the Arriba Las Vegas Worker Center based in Las Vegas when we were confronting workplace abuses at Unforgettable Coding.
Como lo dijo Bliss hace un momento, yo fui el primer indocumentado en salir al público y exponerme ante las cámaras y decir que yo era indocumentado y que estaba sufriendo abusos laborales, y levanté la voz.
So like Bliss said, I was the first worker that came out, undocumented worker that came out in front of the camera and said, I'm undocumented, I'm suffering workplace abuses.
Hemos hecho una lucha muy larga y me siento feliz de saber que hoy en día hemos logrado algo histórico y hemos abierto las puertas para que en un futuro otros trabajadores reciban estas mismas protecciones.
And we have carried forward this long struggle, but today I am happy because today is a historical day. We have broken open these doors to give the opportunity so that other workers one day in the near future may have the same protections that we have.
Logramos que Mayorkas saliera a hacer pública la póliza donde promete que va a haber más protecciones para los trabajadores indocumentados y que va a haber más vigilancia hacia las compañías como Unforgettable Coding que hacen prácticas abusadoras de robo de salario y maltrato. Together
we have obtained that Secretary Mayorkas has today made public the promise that they will protect workers' rights, and they will continue to monitor employers that have abusive practices like unforgettable codings.
Ayer miré en las noticias que el Departamento de Labor de los Estados Unidos lanzó una nueva aplicación para que cada trabajador la use en su trabajo y de esa manera poder saber si le están robando el salario y en un futuro demandar a la compañía y abrir un caso para que puedan ser elegibles para una acción diferida.
And just yesterday, I remember hearing the news that the Labor Department actually is advancing a new application for workers who have suffered wage theft, so that perhaps maybe a process like this can help workers open a case and in the future, for example, obtain these same kind of protections.
Todo esto no hubiera podido ser posible sin la ayuda de trabajadores del centro Arriba Las Vegas, sin la ayuda de Andy Long, que nos han apoyado a los trabajadores desde un principio en esta lucha.
And it's worth saying that all of this is possible because of the workers and the members and the work of groups like Arriba Las Vegas Worker Center and the National Day Labor Organizing Network, NDLON.
Ahora tenemos que seguir más fuertes que nunca y seguir en la lucha y no bajar la guardia y estar al pendiente de que tanto el Departamento de Labor como el Departamento de Seguridad Nacional cumplan con lo que nos han prometido.
And now today we must double down on our efforts and in our struggle to ensure that the Labor Department and Homeland Security, that they both keep their promises to protect these workers.
Muchas gracias a todos y ojalá logremos todos los cambios que estamos esperando a nivel nacional y que no vuelva a haber más abusos y robos de salario hacia las familias inmigrantes.
And so thank you to all. I really do hope that we are making the changes at the national level so that we can finally end wage theft and that there are no more cases of the theft of wages of immigrant working families. Thank you. Muchas gracias, Rosario. Thank you very much, Rosario. That's Rosario Ortiz from the Arriba Las Vegas Worker Center and from one of the pilot cases. Okay, and next up, we have just confirming here. Thank you very much, Rosario. We have actually the staff attorney and workers' rights director from the National Day Labor Organizing Network, Mr. Cal Soto, who is also going to share a little bit about what this policy means and what this policy means. Adelante.
Thank you, Chava, y gracias, Rosario. I think that it's so important. I'm so happy to share this moment to speak next to Rosario so that we understand today being such a historic moment, but one that was defined and created by workers like Rosario, La Jonas, Isaac, and many others across the country who have taken a great risk, as Bliss said earlier, to already come forward and already push for this administration to create a pathway for them to be protected from really an epidemic of retaliation that happens in work sites against undocumented workers. So the announcement today by Secretary Mayorkas is something that is extremely important and is something that could completely change the pathway of how we see the ability for workers to enforce their rights as long as it is actually brought out to the community and identified as a tool that workers everywhere can use, and is really, like the Secretary said today, used to make sure that the work of immigration enforcement is no longer utilized to undermine and conflict with the important work of actually enforcing labor laws. So today, we saw a formalization, really creating a formal pathway for workers to come forward and get protections when they are involved in or potentially involved in a labor rights investigation. Workers who have potential, for example, wage theft claim, a health and safety violation, workplace sexual abuse claim, discrimination claim, can go to the appropriate agency, federal, state, or local, begin a labor investigation, and be given through that process of an investigation a pathway to apply for deferred action for the duration of that investigation and potentially beyond that, in order to take away the fear of retaliation and the risk that already exists for workers when they come forward because unscrupulous employers want to utilize their status against them in order to evade the law. So some highlights I'd like to point out. One, as was mentioned before, there have already been some emblematic cases that have pushed for DHS and the Department of Labor and other labor agencies like the NLRB, the EEOC, to actually utilize this power. And so examples like the case in Las Vegas, examples like in Georgia, where Georgia Familias Unidas, and we'll hear from Maria Rosario later about the poultry workers there, cases in Mississippi, the poultry raids. Those workers have already come forward and pushed for their labor cases to be qualified as cases that will be receiving protection, this deferred action or other prosecutorial discretion as a protection. So this announcement today formalizes that process. And what we heard today is that, one, DHS is going to create and has created a website that has actual information for workers who are out, who are afraid and wondering how they can protect themselves. And so you can find that information. Just so that folks know how to find it, you should search DHS Supportive Enforcement of Labor and Employment Laws. In Spanish, apoyo del DHS a la aplicación de las leyes laborales y de empleo. And I wanted to just give that site so that you can search it, and all those who are out there listening can confirm that, yeah, this is a real thing that's actually happening. And that's one of the really important things that happened today. The administration and Secretary Mayorkas stepping out publicly and saying that this is a pathway for protection. Two, they explicitly extended this to state and local labor investigations. And so while this definitely was a pathway in the past, now we have explicit actual approval that, yes, cases that are labor enforcement cases that arise not only from federal offices, but also from state and local offices, thinking of state departments of labor like the California Department of Labor and New York Department of Labor, for example. Those state agencies can also request the protection for witnesses and victims of labor abuses in their cases so that these important witnesses to their investigations can be protected. A third very important aspect of this announcement is that workers will have these cases. This is a priority case, and so they'll be processed in a central location, which we hope will help to expedite the processing of these protections, because these are protections that do need to be expedited. They're things that are retaliation that have already been experienced or are real current risks to the actual implementation of labor law. And so what we see today in the policy announcement is that these are expedited cases, and they will be handled by a central facility within DHS. And finally, that this will be something that can be concurrently applied to when we're talking about applying for deferred action for protection and the work authorization, that those things can happen at the same time. So a lot of these exist within the new FAQ announcement. I think that, though, returning to the beginning of what I was saying, probably the most important aspect of today is that this is a public statement from the Department of Homeland Security, from the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, saying that we understand how our immigration enforcement has interfered with labor law enforcement. We understand that there are bad employers who want to take advantage of workers' fear of retaliation, workers' fear of their status, immigration status. And we are now going to create a process for any undocumented worker who has this potential labor investigation for them to come forward and be protected without fear of that retaliation, and not only be protected, but really be assisted in their participation in investigating labor crimes so that all workers have the same level of protection against these types of abuses, that we're not having a second tier of workers in this country whose work is less valuable, whose work is less respected, but that all work is respected and that all workers have the right to come forward without that fear of retaliation. And so it is a historic day, and it will be an historic day for sure, as these workers like Rosario, Jonas, workers from Georgia, Gafu, workers in Mississippi and beyond, as they come forward to start to not only bring their labor cases, but to bring their communities together to say, look, we were protected, we were able to come forward and bring forward our case because we had this protection, and you can too. So I think we're going to start to see a real evolution of our labor enforcement, and we hope to see this really expand and extend labor rights, not only for these workers, but for all workers in this country who face similar retaliation, and there'll be one less tool for these bad employers. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cal Soto from Endelon, Workers' Rights Director. Next, we're going to be hearing a little bit about, what are some of the pending questions, right? Outstanding questions about the policy from Maria del Rosario Palacios from Georgia Familias Unidas, from Georgia Familias Unidas, based out of Gainesville, Georgia. Adelante, Rosario.
Thank you, Chava. Thank you to everyone listening in today. Like Chava said, my name is Maria del Rosario. I am one of the co-founders of Georgia Familias Unidas. If you're unfamiliar with us, we're a volunteer group of poultry plant workers and their children, of which I am both. I'm formerly an undocumented poultry plant worker in what we call the poultry capital of the world in Gainesville, Georgia. If you don't know, a couple years ago, we had a tragic and very preventable nitrogen leak. It's actually the 2-year anniversary is coming up in 17 days on January 30th. And workers have complained for months on end about new equipment that was being installed, about the smell of different gases that were being released when the equipment was attempted to be installed. And we lost that day the lives of 6 of our folks, 5 of whom had lived the majority of their life undocumented. Only one had recently gained permanent residency and was never able to use it outside of the U.S. And so many questions come, as today's announcement has been long awaited by our members, by many folks who wanted a formal process to be able to hold in accountability agencies that have not always listened to the pleas, the cries, the deaths, the mourning, the grief of our undocumented workers. And so we ask, what is next? We're glad to see a centralized process. We know in Atlanta, things, the timeframes and the decisions are very different than other parts of the country. We've seen it firsthand. We know that, as one of the first organizations that got to see these cases piloted, we know that the amount of documentation required to be able to submit an application has been at the forefront of each one of our workers, our brave workers who spoke to OSHA officials, who spoke to the Department of Labor, knowing that they were undocumented. What documentation process will look like, how the streamlined process will improve. And, a bigger question is Gainesville sits in a county that has 287G. If you don't know, 287G is a optional program where the police officers double as ICE agents. It's the way I explain it to a lot of our folks. And so every single time, because Georgia traffic violations are criminalized, every single time one of our folks is caught driving without a license, they fail to yield. It's not an exaggeration. Our folks are processed through the immigration system and they have prior encounters. So what happens when so many of our people, you know, Gainesville has the highest per capita of undocumented immigrants in the country. So many of our folks have been processed with ICE. What will that process look like under an agency that has caused a lot of pain in our community? So, you know, there's a lot of questions. I can't speak for everyone on here, but I know those are questions at the forefront with discussions that we are having here in Georgia. And we are excited. This is a win. This is a step in a right direction, but we will not forget that so many other folks who are undocumented still don't have coverage and full protections. And so we hope that this process, you know, answers to those questions a lot better.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria del Rosario from Georgia Familias Unidas. And it's such an important time where we are coming up on that date of the tragedy that happened, the preventable tragedy that happened in Gainesville, Georgia, and the lives lost. That date coming up at the very end of January. So it's a stark reminder that these protections didn't come soon enough. But however, we need to push them, and that workers across the country can't wait. This is an urgent issue. This is a crisis that workers are facing. It's a stark reminder, but an important reminder. Thank you, Rosario. And it's important to recognize that, you know, we're going to keep it short. We don't want to drag on too long. But it's really important to recognize that an announcement like today doesn't happen without the collaboration and organizing and mobilizing and engagement and courage of workers and grassroots organizations across the country. And so it's so important to recognize the work and the organizing of the day labor centers, of the worker centers, of the workers' rights orgs, of the grassroots committees across the country. Arise Chicago was also moving one of the pilot cases. And just a heads up, if somebody from Arise would want to share a quick reflection also. But groups like Arise Chicago, groups like We Count in Florida, groups like Workers Defense Project in Texas, Unidad Latina en Acción in New Jersey, Unidad Latina en Acción in Connecticut, the Pomona Economic Opportunity Center, Salva organization based up just north of Los Angeles. And if I'm missing anybody, but so many organizations, day labor centers, organizers, and working people, for example, across the South, that have been pushing this forward and really making it happen. And so, first, we wanted to say thank you for the work and onward. And we wanted to give the opportunity. I don't know if somebody from Arise Chicago wanted to say even if a quick reflection, just un saludo before we close up.
I guess un saludo and a reflection. No policy ever works if you don't push for it and you are not constantly watching the policies really enacted. So the cases we have, the initial cases, let's call them the grandfather cases, those are a good experiment, but there's just that. So let's see how new cases on the guidelines of DHS, let's see how they work. And as cases multiply, let's see what happens. Because one very interesting thing is that all government offices can support this process. So in Chicago, we have the Office of Labor Standards. They would be able to issue letters of support. We have the Cook County Commission on Human Rights. They should be able to issue letters of support. But let's test that to see if it happens. You know, the Illinois Department of Labor and so on and on. So let's taste it, and that's it. Dale duro.
Eso. I think those are the perfect words to close us up with the idea that this policy, how are we going to assess this policy? We're going to assess it on its merits. And that means, how is it actually implemented in reality? What does this policy mean for the workers in Mississippi today, in Chicago today, across, the Midwest, across the South, the workers in Florida, in Texas, California, Jersey, right? That's how we're going to judge this policy, how it's actually brought to fruition. And, the message definitely to our local and national leaders, whether that's President Biden and also our mayors and our governors and our members of Congress, whether they're going to help us promote this policy and make sure, they're out there to defend it and to promote it and let it be known that this policy exists, which is necessary, because a policy that no one knows about, a right that no one knows about, is a right that's not going to be advanced and enforced. So with that, thank you everybody for joining. And as we said, dale y dale duro. Gracias. And that concludes our taping, if we can stop recording now. And everybody, this is not part of the recording, but just before, if folks, there's a couple reporters that haven't jumped off. The folks that are on here are from a lot of the organizations that have been moving this forward. I know, there's some folks here, so if folks want to have any questions and want to put them in the chat, that you're also welcome to do that. We appreciate it. Yes, does somebody want to make a quick plug for the Facebook Live at 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific?
Yeah, Radio Jornalera, as you can see, posted there, facebook.com/Radio Jornalera, today, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. We will have a Facebook Live with worker centers across the country talking about the impact of this policy and talking a little bit more about the details of it. So please join us. Facebook.com/Radio Jornalera, Radio Jornalera.
Please stop recording. Okay, they're going to keep recording us until we jump off. So, but on a serious note, if any of the folks, any of the reporters have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask any questions. Or if you want follow up, you could just let us know. Most of you that have contact are already in touch with some of the organizations.
Bueno, pues ahí lo que estaban escuchando era básicamente la conferencia de prensa a nivel nacional, ya que esta mañana el secretario de Seguridad Nacional, que es el secretario Mayorkas, de origen cubano, hizo el anuncio de protecciones temporales para trabajadores que están demandando a sus patrones. Y cuando estamos hablando de demandas, puede ser por no pagar el salario mínimo, por no pagar la prima extra cuando se trabaja más de 40 horas, por sufrir represalia porque el trabajador pues está demandando por sus derechos, o también por el tema del acoso sexual o el abuso sexual o el asalto sexual en los lugares de trabajo. Entonces ayer hicimos una conferencia de prensa ahí en la alcaldía, pues pidiendo de que este anuncio se hiciera, porque pues ya veníamos toda la semana veníamos esperando que este anuncio se diera y no se había dado todavía. Entonces lo que ayer se hizo una acción a nivel nacional donde muchas localidades, muchas ciudades hicieron sus conferencias de prensa porque decían que básicamente necesitábamos que esa póliza ya saliera del Departamento de Seguridad Nacional. El Departamento de Trabajo de los Estados Unidos ya la había aprobado, ya había dicho que sí, que estaban de acuerdo, pero es que el problema es de que el Departamento de Trabajo no es el que da los alivios migratorios. Entonces necesitábamos contar con la aprobación por parte del Departamento de Seguridad Nacional, que es la oficina principal que abarca al Departamento de Inmigración. Entonces, pues ya el anuncio se hizo ayer y ahora lo que se está pidiendo es que básicamente que el mismo Departamento de Seguridad Nacional pues promueva estas protecciones y que ojalá el presidente Biden también ya lo diga él públicamente, porque pues básicamente es posible que salga la póliza, pero el presidente Biden nunca va a decir, pues para no tener tantos enemigos o para no hacer más enemigos, pero bueno, ahí por lo menos ayer ahí en la alcaldía de New Haven tuvimos una rueda de prensa donde hubo alrededor de 50 personas, donde básicamente tuvimos la presencia de muchos trabajadores, gente de Unidad Latina en Acción. Tuvimos al presidente de CIU a nivel del estado de Connecticut, tuvimos a la gente del FLCIO, hay gente de la Escuela de Leyes de la Universidad de Yale, particularmente a nuestro abogado estrella James Bandari Alexander, gente de la Iglesia Unitaria del estado de Connecticut, particularmente la de Hamden, y además de eso también tuvimos la presencia pues del alcalde de la ciudad de New Haven, y pues el evento se hizo dentro de la alcaldía, pues porque pues afuera estaba lloviendo y pues ¿dónde mamá lo vamos a hacer? En la casa nuestra. ¿Dónde es nuestra casa? ¿Dónde que se mantiene con los impuestos que pagamos nosotros? Pues la alcaldía de la ciudad. Y pues fue bueno porque pues ya básicamente ya la gente ha estado empezando a hablar sobre eso y pues estábamos sumándonos a una petición a nivel nacional. Afortunadamente ya esta mañana, alrededor de las 10 de la mañana, pues ya el secretario Mayorgas ya lo anunció públicamente. Entonces, pues eso fue un buen anuncio. Ese anuncio, pues ya saben que si usted está enfrentado al tema del robo salarial, pues y usted ha sufrido represalias o ha sufrido amenazas de que le van a llamar la migra, pues usted ya sabe que allá hay una protección adicional donde básicamente usted puede pedir un permiso temporal que eventualmente usted lo puede convertir primero en un tema de un permiso de trabajo para laborar aquí en los Estados Unidos, y pues ya con ese permiso temporal pues usted ya también puede básicamente sacar un Social Security. Ya sabe que con esos documentos pues ya se le facilita para sacar otro montón de documentos, ya puede sacar la licencia del Estado, no la licencia para inmigrantes, sino la licencia regular, y ya puede hacer otros trámites y volar libremente entre los Estados Unidos. Entonces, pues es un anuncio, es una lucha que ya se lleva más de 2 años. Pues recuerde que hace 2 años estábamos viajando a la ciudad de Boston, donde se hizo una rueda de prensa porque el que en esa época era el alcalde de la ciudad de Boston, Mary Walsh, pues básicamente eventualmente fue invitado a ser el secretario de Trabajo de los Estados Unidos. Entonces la idea era que no se olvide de nosotros, no se olvide que ya habíamos tenido conversaciones en privado y él había dicho que iba, cuando yo fuera secretario del Trabajo de los Estados Unidos, pues iba a dar protecciones temporales para los trabajadores acá, para los trabajadores en general de los Estados Unidos, y pues lo que se pedía básicamente tiene que ayudarnos con este tema de esa protección. Entonces se hizo la rueda de prensa. Eventualmente cuando llegó allá a la presidencia, a la secretaría allá en Washington, pues ya básicamente dijo que sí, que lo iba a hacer, pero hasta ahora no se había logrado que se hiciera el anuncio público por parte del Departamento de Seguridad Nacional, y particularmente por el secretario Mayorkas, que es el secretario del Departamento de Trabajo. Ahí mismo tenemos en pantalla, tenemos a James Bandari Alexander, que ayer hablaba sobre una cosa muy particular. Decía que muchas veces cuando el patrón te amenaza, porque cuando tú dices, patrón, es que usted no me está pagando lo correcto, no me paga, y el patrón dice, es que te va a llamar inmigración, es como si te pusiera una pistola en la cabeza. Y decía, esa pistola en la cabeza del trabajador por parte del patrón se quita con este anuncio nuevo de que va a haber protección para los trabajadores que están denunciando a sus patrones. Ahí mismo ahí en pantalla tenemos a Megan, una de las cofundadoras y organizadoras de Unidad Latina, con Luis Tlalmis. Luis Tlalmis es el trabajador que era el cocinero de Miller's Restaurant, el restaurante japonés muy famoso aquí en New Haven, que actualmente pues cerró, pero ahora mismo está operando desde una finca en la ciudad, en el pueblo de Woodbridge. Y ahí tenemos trabajadores de Unidad Latina en Acción. Ahí tenemos al frente a nuestra compañera Bela Vázquez, que ella denunciaba que a ella le debe más de 7 cheques, que básicamente cheques que no tienen fondos, y pues están denunciando ahora a su patrón. Ella, alrededor de otros 20 trabajadores están en la misma situación. Entonces, pues es es esta actividad de festividad que se vino dando ayer. Ahí estaba el alcalde Justin Elicker diciendo, es que la ciudad de New Haven trabaja muy de cerca con el Departamento de Trabajo. Estamos yéndonos detrás de todas esas tiendas de esquina que están robando y abusando de sus trabajadores. Yo decía, pero esos no son los peores, es una pobre tienda de esquina que sostiene una familia. ¿Por qué no habla de los restaurantes o de su amigo Boonlight, que es el dueño de Millas Restaurant? Ahí mismo teníamos en la fotografía que se estaba mostrando ahora último, ahí estaba el presidente del SEIU Connecticut. Él decía que pues básicamente SEIU tiene alrededor de 60,000 trabajadores afiliados aquí en el estado de Connecticut, y pues que básicamente la idea era que la lucha de los trabajadores norteamericanos es la lucha también de los trabajadores inmigrantes y los trabajadores que básicamente no tienen muchas protecciones simplemente porque no tienen los papeles. Y pues hoy en la alcaldía, pues ya pasando a otro tema completamente diferente, les quería anunciar de que hoy se hizo la lectura de ese famoso discurso de Martin Luther King que se llamaba Más allá de Vietnam. No sé si lo han leído ustedes alguna vez. A ver, el joven allá. No lo ha leído. El señor peruano, el señor dominicano, más allá de Vietnam, que es el discurso donde básicamente Martin Luther King denunciaba el papel de los Estados Unidos en Vietnam. Él denunciaba que, por ejemplo, mientras que se está luchando acá por las libertades civiles para la comunidad negra, pues al mismo tiempo esa gente que en ese momento estaban viviendo separados, los blancos y los negros que vivían segregados, o los negros que vivían segregados pues de los barrios blancos o de las comunidades blancas, básicamente en el frente de batalla allá en Vietnam estaban todos juntos masacrando al pueblo vietnamita. Y es básicamente un llamado a la paz y básicamente a la no intervención por parte de las potencias más allá de Vietnam. A ver, es que quiero ver si de pronto les en español. Más allá de Vietnam. Martin Luther King dio su discurso más allá de Vietnam. Más allá de Vietnam. Básicamente es ese discurso que mucha gente cree que hasta por ese mismo pues pudo haber sido asesinado. Entonces quería leer una parte acá que fue la que me tocó leer el día de hoy, pero él decía que por ejemplo lo que pasó en Vietnam, básicamente Vietnam, yo no sé si ustedes saben, pero Vietnam era una colonia francesa, y cuando empezaron a liberarse de los franceses, pues básicamente los Estados Unidos se intervino para que básicamente no lograra su independencia, incluso apoyó en un 80% en el gasto militar para que los Estados Unidos, o para que no se liberara Vietnam, y básicamente pues eventualmente los Estados Unidos termina siendo el... mira, por ejemplo acá dice: mi tercera razón se mueve a nivel de aún más profundo de la conciencia, ya que surge de mi experiencia en los guetos del norte, y estamos hablando de los guetos negros aquí en los Estados Unidos, especialmente de los últimos 3 veranos, como yo he caminado entre los hombres jóvenes, negros, desesperados, rechazados y enojados. Les he dicho que los cócteles Molotov, o sea, las bombas Molotov y fusiles, no resolverían sus problemas, porque esa era la forma como muchas veces la gente respondía frente a la violencia de los blancos. He tratado de ofrecerles mis más profundas compasión, manteniendo al mismo tiempo mi convicción de que el cambio social es más significativo a través de la acción no violenta. Pero se preguntaron, y con razón, ¿pero qué pasa en Vietnam? Se preguntaron si nuestra propia nación no estaba, o sea, los Estados Unidos no estaba usando dosis masivas de la violencia para poder resolver sus problemas. para lograr los cambios que quería allá en Vietnam. Sus preguntas me hicieron sentir y yo sabía que nunca más podría elevar mi voz contra la violencia de los oprimidos en los guetos sin primero haber hablado claramente al mayor proveedor de violencia en el mundo. Y eso lo decía Martin Luther King. Decía, mi voz contra la violencia de los oprimidos en los guetos, después, sin hablar claramente, en contra del mayor proveedor de violencia en el mundo del día de hoy. Está hablando de los Estados Unidos en esa época, allá en los Estados, en Vietnam. Mi propio gobierno, por el bien de los niños, por el bien de este gobierno, por el bien de los cientos de miles temblando bajo nuestra violencia, no puedo permanecer en silencio. Entonces no crean que Martin Luther King solamente dijo, yo tengo un sueño. No. Martin Luther King decía que básicamente uno no podía mantenerse callado frente a la violencia de este país allá en Vietnam y en otros países del mundo. Sino lo que pasa es que leyendo el discurso, si usted lo lee, pues básicamente es un discurso que se lee más o menos en una hora, pero uno dice, ¿qué ha cambiado desde ese momento, desde Vietnam hasta ahora? Porque yo creo que después de Vietnam, después de Vietnam bombardearon a Laos, bombardearon a Camboya, de ahí se metieron en Afganistán, se metieron en Irán, se metieron en Perú, se metieron en Venezuela, se metieron en Honduras, se metieron en Panamá. Y de ahí en adelante siguieron invadiendo y siguen perpetrando violencia a través de todo el mundo. Ahora mismo, pues ellos son los que básicamente apoyan toda esa violencia que ocurre allá en Libia, en Yemen, en otros países del continente. Están haciendo intervención en Cuba, están haciendo intervención en Venezuela, están haciendo intervención en diferentes países de Latinoamérica y pues uno dice, ¿las cosas han mejorado? No, no han mejorado. Entonces, recordar a Martin Luther King como lo que fue, con esa voz que hablaba duro en contra de la violencia, es el Martin Luther King que nosotros tenemos que recordar este fin de semana, porque pues ya hay muchas celebraciones y pues es simplemente un llamado a recordar no solamente a esa frase sin ningún significado, que es yo tengo un sueño. No, él habló mucho más que eso, él habló mucho más últimamente ya estaba hablando en contra de la pobreza, hablaba en contra de cómo se pueden invertir millones de dólares en la guerra, no, pero no se pueden invertir para mejorar las condiciones de la gente pobre aquí en los Estados Unidos, y tal vez por eso fue que él murió. Entonces, pues nada, con eso los dejo, son las 4 de la tarde y pues muchas gracias a todos los que nos participaron el día de hoy. Creo que el miércoles vamos a venir con más información y recuerden que ya es legal la marihuana en el estado de Connecticut. Saludos a todos los que somos marihuaneros. Muy bien, adiós.
Cometen una injusticia al llamarnos terroristas. Los que tumbaron las torres traían visa de turista.